Welcome. My name is Richard Folland, and I'm the Policy and Government Affairs Advisor to the Carbon Tracker Initiative. For those of you who don't know Carbon Tracker, we're a think tank based in the UK, and we have an audience primarily of finance and investment. We look at climate risk and the energy transition, but also policymakers take a major interest in what we publish as well. We've been running for about 12 years, and we've been quite instrumental in terms of pioneering concepts like stranded assets and the carbon bubble. So we've got a great event this afternoon, which is coinciding with a report that we published today about Africa's energy transition. And that's going to be looking at both the challenges and the opportunities. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce you to the panel. But before that, I wanted to just talk through how we're going to run the event over the next 60 minutes or so. First, I will be introducing my colleague, Kofi Mbuk, in a couple of minutes, who's going to be presenting on our report, which was published today. And he's going to present for about 10 minutes or so. I'm then going to invite our three panelists up on stage, and we're going to have a panel discussion for about 20 minutes, something like that. And then I'm going to turn to the audience after that for a Q&A for 20 minutes for yourselves, bearing in mind both that we have audience here in the room, but also that this event is being live streamed as well. And we hope to get some questions coming through from the virtual audience. And then we'll have 5 minutes or so to wrap up. And at least for those of you who are based here at the COP, then maybe you can go off for a well-deserved drink after that. So before I invite Kofi up to give the presentation about the report that we published, if I could introduce our panelists now so you know who they are when they come up. I'm delighted that we have Nafi Chinnery with us. And Nafi is the interim Africa director and the West Africa regional director for the Natural Resource Governance Institute. NRGI, as the acronym is a not-for-profit which looks at resource management. And Nafi herself has previously worked for Oxfam and also the African Women's Development Fund. So she and NRGI are extremely well placed to give us some expert comment on the report and the findings from that. After then to introduce Amos Wemanya, and Amos is with PowerShift Africa, which is an advocacy and think tank organization which is based in Kenya. And Amos is the energy transition manager for PowerShift Africa. Amos previously worked for Greenpeace Africa, and again is extremely well placed to be able to comment on the key findings of this report. And then our final panelist is Janet Rogan, and Janet is going to be giving the perspective of a government policymaker from the global north. And Janet is the COP26 ambassador for Africa and the Middle East. She's held that post since March 2021, so working all the way through COP26 into COP27 here now. And Janet herself has had a distinguished diplomatic career, and also she's worked on the development and humanitarian agenda, and has also been a United Nations resident coordinator. So I'm now going to invite Kofi up to give the presentation. And if I could just introduce Kofi, if you'd like to come up, Kofi. So Kofi is Carbon Tracker's clean tech analyst. He's been with us for over a year now. And before that, Kofi worked both for CDP. He's worked also in tech and has got about 10 years working in renewables and climate policy. So Kofi, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Richard. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as you spend the next few days negotiating, persuading, and agreeing to new sets of climate commitments as you must, it is important not to forget that we are now feeling the direct impact of climate change. Now, this year alone, we have seen extreme summer heats all across Europe, monsoon floods in the heart of Nigeria, India, and Pakistan. Wildfires have intensified in California, and we're now seeing stronger and stronger category hurricanes in the southern peak of the US. Now, last year alone, the global economic damage caused by climate disasters reached $271 billion, with over 10,000 lives lost. Now, had we been more proactive and reactive to the warnings of climate change, this damage capital of $275 billion could have instead been used to build up to 375 gigawatt worth of renewable energy solar, enough power to actually feed the whole of Africa. Now, my dear colleague, there's no point of me standing here and preaching to the choir, because I believe we already know this, right? We are feeling the direct impacts, but ladies and gentlemen, this is just a tip of the iceberg. Now, we must act now. We must be more proactive so we can prevent our future Earth from becoming a climate bubble. Now, the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, he tweeted about 2 weeks ago, and he said that there is no energy security without investing in renewables. However, we are now seeing more and more European nations renege on their climate promises. And what's most of all shocking is that Europe is now looking to Africa for its natural gas supply. Now, this is an important message that we have for African government and African leaders today. Do not get misled by this. Now, gas supply contracts from Africa to Europe should only be seen as a short-term measure to bridge the supply gap lost from Russia. Now, Carbon Tracker believes that this gas pipeline infrastructure will eventually become stranded in the mid to long-term future, particularly on the newly announced $25 billion gas pipeline channel between Nigeria and Morocco that links up to mainland Europe. Now, this will cause a major dent in the GDP of petrostate countries involved, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the solution for Africa is to turn its back on gas and start capitalizing on the record low cost of renewable energy, particularly from solar. Now, Africa is blessed with an abundant sunlight, with an average annual irradiance of over 2,000 kilowatt hours per meter square per year, the second highest amongst all 7 continents. Now, our Carbon Tracker analysis shows that the weighted average levelized cost of electricity for new solar in Africa is now competing directly with the long-run marginal cost of existing coal and gas plants at a rate of roughly $65 per megawatt hour. Now, this means that electric utility companies in Africa can now sign PPA contracts with solar IPPs at a reasonable tariff rate. Now, our analysis further shows that within the next decade, the levelized cost for solar and battery all across Africa will be cheaper than both coal and gas power generating assets, therefore opening up a major channel of opportunity for investors to capitalize on the energy storage market in Africa. But investing in solar in Africa comes with its challenges. Now, most electricity off-takers in Africa are not liquid. They're not liquid enough, and the issue of credibility always comes into play. Access to public finance is always a major hindrance, and the grid system in Africa is outdated and due for a major revamp. And of course, we must not forget social and environmental factors. These factors must be addressed in any investment planning stage. Now, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, with the right policies and international support, particularly from unlocking public capital from development finance institutions, these challenges can be addressed. Now, governments must make Africa's grid more efficient, and mandate all utility off-takers to switch to a paperless form of collecting payments once bills are due to ensure continued liquidity. Government must ensure public and private finance will invest in Africa's electricity sector to expedite grid access in Africa, particularly to more than 500 million people without access to power. Government must ensure that payment guarantees through the support of GFIs are made available to most solar IPPs, not just to a select few. And in conclusion, if we do adopt these policies, Africa could scale up its cumulative installed solar capacity by up to 50-folds by the end of this decade and over 400 gigawatts by 2050, which will without a doubt get Africa a lot closer to energy security and preventing the great continent from becoming a climate bubble. Thank you very much.
Hi, that's better. Yeah, Kofi, thanks very much indeed for that. So if I could invite our panelists up on the stage or the virtual stage here anyway, please. And you might just want to check that mic if it's on there as well. We can pass that one around. Testing 1, 2, 3. Thanks very much, Amos. So you just heard Kofi present the report, which has been published today. And I wonder if I can turn to each of you for some initial comments on what you've read and what you've heard. Perhaps Nafi, if I could turn to you first. I mean, I know that you and NRGI looked very much at an equitable energy transition. Wondering what comments you would have from what you've heard.
Thank you very much, Richard and Carbon Tracker, for the opportunity to be on this panel. At NRGI, as you're aware, we are an international non-profit organization working in countries that are endowed with mineral resources and working on governance issues to ensure that these countries benefit from their natural resource endowments. We've spent some time actually looking at renewable energy governance. And we think that decisions about how we utilize the extractive revenue is important, and these decisions affect the well-being of the people living in the communities. And so it's important that we open up these spaces to include all of the citizens to decide how these decisions are made. We think that the report that has been produced by Carbon Tracker, it's very important. It lays out the clear pathway to show how renewables actually are the right pathway for Africa to pursue, and that there are economic opportunities for Africa to go into renewable than those actually who depend on fossil fuel. And so there are issues for me. I think that there are some issues that we need to consider. So the fundamental issue is about Africa actually requires energy security to power its economy. It's important that we recognize that we have about 600 million Africans who do not have access to electricity. We have about 900 million Africans who do not have access to clean cooking system. This means that the poor woman living in the rural community somewhere in my village is at risk of developing lung cancer or eye disease just by cooking dinner. And we need to establish that fact, that energy security is important to power the economy, health, education, and security of Africa. These are fundamental issues that we need to remember when we are talking about having a just transition and moving into renewables. Currently, most African countries are highly in debt, right? We are struggling to find finances to support our economy. And so as we talk about moving into renewable, we need to ask the critical question that where is that money going to come from? And so we need to open up the spaces for finances to support government and to be able to find the money to build the infrastructure required for renewables, because these are capital intensive and avenue. And I was very pleased to hear as one of the recommendations from the report that access to finance is critical to support diversification into renewable. I will stop here and then allow others to also come in. When we go into a second round of questions, perhaps I would bring out some of the considerations that we need to look at to de-risk the sector and allow Africa to look at options for renewable.
That's great, Nafi. Thanks very much indeed. I think you've opened up 2 or 3 sort of follow-ups there, actually. So we'll come back for that. So Amos, if I could turn to you for your comments, and perhaps I should, in the introduction to PowerShift as well, I should have mentioned that you are prime movers behind the Don't Gas Africa campaign as well. So anyway, I'll leave you to come in on what you would like to say.
Yeah, my name is Amos Wemanya. I work with PowerShift Africa. I think Nafi has already started the conversation, and access to energy, modern energy services in Africa will be very important in helping Africa overcome the challenges of the climate crisis. But the question is, how will Africa meet its energy demands? Of course, at the moment, Africa is at crossroads in meeting its energy demands that are very important for ending many years of underdevelopment, but also helping the continent build resilience to climate crisis, and also ending the current energy poverty on the continent. Africa has one option of following the carbon-intensive fossil fuel pathway or investing in energy systems of the future that are powered by renewables. And the report today has highlighted to us how renewables are not only cost competitive, but when you look at Africa's social dynamics, many people live in remote rural areas. Renewable energy options provides opportunities for decentralized energy systems that are able to power industries, but also enable these communities build resilience. So how we cooperate, especially having international support for Africa's leapfrogging will be very important, because if this support doesn't come by, then Africa will face the challenges and might end up following the carbon-intensive fossil fuel pathway that has got the world into a climate crisis, but also history and experiences on the continent have shown that fossil fuel energy regimes have not benefited Africa. We could not be having over 600 million Africans not having access to electricity if fossil fuel energy systems were working on the continent. They have failed to meet Africa's many years of underdevelopment. So for Africa to be able to leapfrog into an energy system that will help Africa, we will need investments in renewables. And this will mean that, as the report highlights, having those critical policies that support investments in renewables in place. This means international engagements, corporations must be able to support this. We have seen at the moment there's low investments in renewables on the continent. This needs to change. But how is this going to change? It will only change if we put in place necessary measures, including countries, individual countries on the continent, having clear roadmaps, having clear plans and strategies on how they intend to leapfrog and move away from the lack to a space where Africa is a green energy superpower.
Thank you, Amos. Hold that thought about incentivizing renewables and the role of policymakers there, because I'll come back to you on that. Janet, if I could turn to you now. So in your role, you travel in Africa and the Middle East, but have talked to a lot of African governments. I wonder if you could share with us a little bit, some of the, both on the challenges and the opportunities that you hear for the energy transition, relating to the energy transition for African countries.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thanks already made, and Kofi for the description of the paper. And I want to come back to something that paper pointed out at the beginning, which is the trap of the short term And every government in the world is faced with the daily challenges of how to supply what their people need. And in the case of energy, because of the disruption in the global market and winter coming up in the Northern Hemisphere, it's a very big challenge. That we know what the demand is for the winter in the Northern Hemisphere. And just because part of that demand is not being met by its usual supplier, that doesn't mean the demand has grown. It's just that the supply chain is changing. So as you say, Kofi, don't be fooled into thinking that that's a long-term transition. In fact, I would suggest that most of the economies who are depending on that short-term boost are going to be to renewables on a large scale as far as they possibly can in order to secure their supply lines and not to be dependent on unreliable partners. When it comes to the continent, I think it's maybe 22 or so out of 55 countries who are producers. And the others have always been dependent on importing the supplies, or in some cases of hydrocarbons, in some cases are using hydroelectric for their energy supplies. And that means that a majority of the countries on the continent have always been subject to those fluctuations in prices and supply, the problems of having to use Forex for their imports, and a heavy burden that comes along with that, which is also why very many governments have always had to subsidize energy and oil costs for their populations. This makes it, from a policy perspective, really difficult when and it adds an additional element of complexity in thinking about how do you design the transition. Because you may, and everybody does now have through their NDCs and increasingly through long-term energy strategies for transitioning. But it's not only about what you produce or how you produce it, it's also about smart grids. Can you integrate effectively? A lot of the grid is old in some places, it hasn't been modernized, and it doesn't reach everywhere. And actually it's a 20th century model. You know, when we used to have one big old power station spewing out pollution everywhere and giving out electricity, we don't really necessarily need that anymore. We can have distributed grids that can reach further places with renewable modular energy that can provide options that were not there before. There's that old saying, the Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stones, and the oil age is not going to end because we ran out of oil or hydrocarbons, but because technology provided us with different, cleaner, more efficient solutions. And I think that is exactly where we are, and it's very exciting. And I think the challenge for African governments who are hydrocarbon producers at this point in a very fast moving technological scenario is to keep doing the numbers. You have to crunch the numbers and say, does it really make sense to try and exploit a new source to go into new production of oil or gas? And what is that servicing? Is it for revenue purposes? Are you export? Or is it for your internal purposes? Are you trying to use it to provide more energy to people? And if you do the numbers, does it not make more sense to go in the renewable side of things? Now, on top of that, though, I would add the risk elements for governments.
Now we know that the 100 billion commitment that is committed by the high emitters, has still not come through, right? What is the guarantee that if we have to go into renewable, we are going to get the required support, financial support to build the infrastructure required for Africa to go into renewable? We need to consider all of that, right? And in considering that, I think that it's also very important to create the space for a dialogue to happen between African governments and the citizen. We currently don't have that space. We need to ensure that we have all voices that are needed to have this conversation, to talk about the implication of the transition on communities in the room. So having national dialogues, one of the things that NRGI has been pursuing, creating the platform, safe platforms for state and non-state actors to come together to discuss the implication of the transition and what options exist are quite important, right? So this is something that I think that we need to concentrate on when you are about it. Finances, I also talk about the need for commitment from investors to provide finances for building the infrastructure required for renewable. We know that investors like to go into, they don't like to build infrastructure because it's risky, right? How do we open up the space? How do we support our local banks, to provide the lending required to government to build up this infrastructure, right? These are all things that we need to consider when we are talking about renewable. It's important that Africa considers renewable energy, but how to do it is critical. We do not have to do it to disrupt the current economy that we have in Africa. It's important that we consider all of these factors before we make the decision to go into renewable. And that's what I think that is important to consider when you're talking about just energy transition.
Sorry, Jan, did you want to come in then? No, right, no. Access to finance, maybe we can come back to that in the Q&A, and also your idea of opening up this space for dialogues between governments and civil society. Sounds very interesting. Amos, wonder if I could turn to you, and one of the issues that you touched on in your opening intervention is what policymakers can do in terms of opening up the renewables market. I wonder if you'd like to elaborate on that and give us one or two thoughts there and recommendations. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the key things is that, like Janet was alluding to, we have undue incentives going to fossil fuel regime, where countries subsidize oil and gas, and that makes it more competitive, look like it's more competitive to renewables. But the thing is, renewables are cost competitive. And another thing that I would like to touch on is the cooperation, the level of cooperation. Africa has had energy challenges for a very long time. Like we have already mentioned, over 600 million Africans do not have access to electricity, but that did not see a rush and a dash that we are seeing at the moment. The energy crisis we're having is a European crisis, energy crisis, and European energy crisis has seen a rush for Africa's gas. Last year when we were in Glasgow, some of the countries that are running to Africa to invest in Africa's gas had signed on to Glasgow statement saying that they are going to end investments in fossil fuels abroad. But right now we can see a turnaround of things, and now they want to sanitize gas and make gas look like a clean transitional fuel. What needs to be done? We need to be consistent, and we need to call out some of this hypocrisy, the European hypocrisy, but also be able to help African countries come up with plans and strategies that meet people's energy needs, people-centered energy decisions, people-centered energy policies. Because when you look at the current projects, the way they are structured, they are in form of pipelines, and all pipelines are leading to the coastline. That means we are continuing to invest in the very system that is very elitist, that is very extractionist, that has left Africans without access to energy. So if we are to help Africa meet its priority needs in terms of energy, which are energy access for development, energy access to be able to build resilience to the climate crisis, then we need to develop systems that are very just. My sister Nafi was talking about opening up spaces for participation, but not just participation, but also allowing Africans to own their energy systems. What we have at the moment is an energy systems that is owned by a few elitist multinational corporations on the continent. We need an energy system by the people, for the people. And that can only happen if we put in place key strategies, if we put in place subsidies for equipment, but also make available technologies that are key for the transition. Issues of IPs need to be addressed. Issues of trade relations, power dynamics in the value chain need to be addressed if we are to enable Africans to have an energy system that is fit for purpose, but also that will meet Africa's energy needs.
Thank you, Amos. People-centered transition, very powerful intervention. Janet, in your opening remarks, you talked about the complexity of this. And I wonder if there was a single recommendation or point you would make in your conversations with African governments and so on, what they should do in terms of prioritizing the transition along the pathway which we're talking about. What would you single out? You might want to single out more than one, but just wondering. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, give me the hard question. Actually, people don't realize, I think, how complex it is to provide electricity that you can turn on at the flick of a switch. It's a vast industry, as I think everybody's kind of touched on here. If you want to make a transition and hit those targets that we've all agreed to, you really do need a robust strategy and a plan. And you can't do that unless you have everybody involved in it, in the room as you design it, as you talk about it and design it. It can't be top down, it can't be bottom up. It's got to be a combination. It has to have government. Government's job is to set the overall direction, to do the legislation, to do the regulations, to provide the environment. You need the private sector. Essentially, the private sector are providing the services in most cases. Sometimes it's a combination of government and private sector, but this is also where the emissions come from. So if you want to reduce emissions, they have to be around the table. They have to be part of the strategy. And communities, because communities are the consumers, they are the people who need the jobs that require electricity. The future is electrified. Consumers are the people who buy cars, who need to use electricity in the future that will be electric. So we also, as individuals and communities, as consumers and as workers, need to be part of that. And because our communities, and I'm just looking at this picture here up behind us of a great solar array, communities find power stations, whether they're solar or whether they're the old style, right next to them. And in a number of cases in planning, I know these big things have been built looking wonderful, and then they bypass the local community who thinks, hang on a second, I'm not getting any electricity benefit from this. So that space that Nafi talked about is really important at all levels of this setting of the strategy, because if we're going to make the shift on the scale that is required with the complexity that's required, everybody needs to be in it together. They all have different roles, and we don't want to cross from one role into the other, but we all need to be commenting on it and being part of it. Not least because the scale of debt that is included in these things, or the scale of investment, depending which perspective you're looking from, is very long term. It's very huge. It's long term. It's taken on multi-generationally, if you like. And that's also an element that needs to be in the factors. It sounds like a boring, civil servant thing to say, but unless you actually have that kind of strategy and plan that includes all of the stakeholders, you're gonna fall over at some point. It's not going to work.
Thank you, Janet. I can see there's a common theme coming through from all of you here. So Kofi, you've been sitting very patiently there. I'm going to give you one question in a moment, but while just before I ask that, just to say, I'm going to turn it over to the audience after that. So if you'd like to think about questions you would like to ask, things that have come up either about the report, what you've heard from the panel, and also checking with my colleague Evgenia at the back whether we got stuff coming through online as well, but we'll check on that in a moment. So Kofi, from what you've heard, the idea of a regional power pool, you know, thinking with your background in the industry, wondering if you've got any thoughts about that specifically.
Sure. First and foremost, I think most electricity utility companies all across Africa, most of them are 99% all state-owned, from Eskom to, you know, every single distribution company in Nigeria, to even Canal Power right here in Egypt. They're all state-owned. And the issue with state-owned electricity type, state-owned run electricity companies is that it is not run very, very well. And, you know, in terms, I mean, what we actually need is we need to introduce and unlock a lot of public finance. Public finance to actually come into the electricity sector, public finance to revamp the electricity sector. And this may be challenging, and, you know, some of you may challenge me on this, is to actually privatize the electricity sector. Because if you unlock public capital to revamp the entire sector, to make the grid more sustainable, and then you then plug in private finance as well to introduce new power players, new electricity power players, then it's going to be relatively easy to introduce new set of IPPs. It's going to be relatively easy for that private finance or public finance to actually extend grid access to the more than 500-600 million people without access to power. So I actually encourage your question. I believe that's what Africa actually needs. It needs to, in my own personal view, to actually privatize the local electricity sector, because by privatizing the sector, you introduce a lot of competition among utility companies that can actually even drive the cost down for consumers, and you can make electricity a lot more accessible to the local communities. And just to quickly touch on her point on getting the society and the community together, that's a very, very important factor. And on our report, we highlight that as the ESG factors, because I think that's important for the communities to be in cohesion to build or to develop any renewable energy plants in the continent.
Thanks, Kofi. Privatizing the sector. Maybe we can come back to the panelists on that, depending. But now I'm going to throw this open to the audience and see if we've got questions that you would like to put to the panelists. Yeah, the gentleman there, please. If you could give your name and who you're with.
Thank you. My name is Harald Fuhr. I'm teaching international politics and development at the University of Potsdam in Germany. And I'm basically puzzled. I've seen, Kofi, the slide number 9, I think, was government must, government must, government should, government must. This is a huge issue. I mean, I'm talking about a political economy of change. And you're a government advisor, and I think where most people would be extremely happy if these transitions would be managed well, participatory, justly. But as you rightly pointed out, there are some preconditions for governments to behave adequately and manage it inclusively. So is this also addressed in your report? So the governance gaps, the political economy of these changes, because that doesn't automatically work well. And you talked about privatization. There's a huge story about privatization around the world. So this is not going to be easy, right? And do you have any ideas of how this transition could be made more smoothly and effectively and efficiently by governments?
Thank you very much. Great question. Yeah, Kofi, if you want to take that first, but also one or two of the other panelists might want to come in as well. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, the reason why we actually state government must and government should, because it starts from the governments. Governments need to actually introduce those favorable policies for the private sector and the public sector to actually come in. My experience before I could join in Carbon Tracker, I was a solar project developer, so I could develop utility scale projects all across sub-Saharan Africa. And my personal experience was that the government always made it possible for us to easily and smoothly develop and actually plan projects. The major bottleneck that we faced was access to public finance. So private finance was always there to actually service the usual structures which most solar energy projects in Africa is 70-30. 70% financed by debt, 30% financed by equity. The private sector usually takes on the equity, and we actually need debt finance, particularly from DFIs, to actually fund the debt. And that was very, very difficult to actually access because most DFI, they have just a select few projects per year. So it was very, very difficult for us to actually get access to public finance with a reasonable low interest rates to actually fund the debt.
Thank you, Kofi. Janet, you wanted to come in on this as well.
Yeah, it is actually a real legacy, I mean, current, but also future legacy issue for the political economy and governments. And not just government, but the whole state-owned structures, which are very heavy and long-standing and deep-rooted, including with individuals and individual interests, which have been long there. I can think of an example of a country I visited recently, I'm not going to say which one, where one of the core elements that they were wrestling with, the government had a direction, but it's a question of unions. And in this instance, the union was representing the concerns of their members across the industry about the private sector joining into what had up to then been a public sector dominated and a public investment dominated space. So the good news is that the government is finding a way forward on that, and it's moving. This is bringing renewable energy into a traditional scenario. And it required an understanding that let's not have a standoff about this, because we have to be in it together. We have to make the transition. If we're going to make the transition, and if the unions and their members are concerned about it, then there needs to be a dialogue. There needs to be a dialogue that builds confidence, makes people understand that expanding the space and expanding the options is actually going to expand jobs. It's going to expand the capacity. It's going to bring new skills. So in fact, there's going to be a win-win here if everybody can get into that space. But you're quite right to point out the political economy of this. It's extremely complicated. It's amazing that in many cases it works as well as it does, as you've described, because governments wish to and see they have to enable private sector to come in. They can't do it themselves for renewables in particular. I was thinking solar. But they can enable it. I think we're in a very different space now than we were at the time the Paris Agreement was signed, where the big question, the big argument then was how do we do the feed-in tariffs? How do we do the distribution part of this so that it becomes economically viable? We seem to have solved that one in a very short space of time. So this agenda is moving very fast, but I still think there's a lot to be done on understanding not just the physical thing of unbundling, say, if you want to privatize, but unbundling the structures, the political economy and the mindset. I think that can be as much a hurdle as the actual technical side of it.
Thank you, Janet. Before I turn to the audience again, Nafi, Amos, let's come in on this question of gaps in sort of government institutions and arrangements and so on, political economy.
I think what we've seen with a few countries that have developed their energy transition plan is that governments don't actually engage citizens in developing some of these plans. And for me, I think that it's important to have a plan that's actually push, I don't know whether to use the word push government to engage with the citizens, because the plan for renewable has to address real needs of the people. It has to be context specific. It had to support them from where they are into the new phase. And the only way that can be done is by creating the space to get all people, including women, youth, and communities involved in these discussions. And if we are not careful, we are going to have a government in Africa that is going to develop a plan that actually does not address the key issue of energy access that we are trying to address here. And so we have to find a way of creating that space, right? Bringing the discussion to the people, right? Getting the people involved, getting the people to monitor government plans, getting the people to say whether whatever plans that they have in place would address their real needs and support their growth from one stage to the other. And because this, as I said before, and this is quite capital intensive and it's long term, right? It's going to change people's ways of life. And it's important that we have, we create the space for an inclusive discussion and conversation to have a plan that speaks and address the real issues of countries.
And as you so eloquently put, I think, Nafi, if it does not address access to energy, I mean, that's a tragedy.
And that's a tragedy,
Yeah. Amos, did you want to comment at all on this question of challenges for governments? You don't have to, but if you would like to.
Just a quick one. The question would be energy for who and energy for what? Like my Nafi say. So that's very important. Government need to develop key industries that energy access can power to be able to develop communities, but also help them build resilience.
Thank you, Amos. So I'm turning to the audience again. Do we have more questions here? Yes, please. Yeah, one then two. Let's take them together in the interest of time.
Yeah, I just wondered how you think you can really address the challenge on the ground for rural communities and building up energy access for them. Because I recently went to Nigeria. I'm a journalist and I went there to cover solar mini grids. And I saw that this could potentially really work beyond like solar home systems, but actually the work that needs to be done on the ground is just as much like a kind of development effort, community by community, than it is looking at like gigawatts or cost of solar and that kind of thing. And if that work doesn't happen, it may not reach potential. And then, I'm just wondering your view on that, because it's a massive challenge.
Great, thank you for your question. Just hold that for the moment. Sorry, could I ask just which organisation?
I work for the charitable part of Reuters.
Right, thank you very much. And there was a gentleman there as well, please.
Thank you. I'm Giles Bristow, who works for Ashton, and also representing the Power Up Coalition. I just a question, a very simple question, but might have a complicated answer, which is, what would the panel like to see coming out of this COP? So out of the negotiations itself, either this time or in the next one in the MENA COP, that would really help to accelerate this agenda? That's
a great question, Giles. Thank you. So the panel, you can start thinking about that, your outcomes from the COP. But going back to the first question about challenges for rural communities, who would like to pick that one up?
Yeah, I think the thing is building industries. Energy for just lighting a bulb, I think that is not commercially viable. So we need to make investments in renewable energy commercially viable, and that is building local industries, agriculture, health, education. That way we'll have to attract investments in the energy. A quick one on what we'd like to see from COP27 is, for a very long time, climate finance has not been coming by. We would like to see increased commitments for providing the much needed climate finance that would be able to help Africa transition. But before I finish, we continue in conversations around energy transitions for development in Africa in IRENA Pavilion. So feel free to join us in a few minutes.
Yes, well said, Amos. So you can move seamlessly from this event to the Irina Pavilion. There we are. We planned this really well, you know. So Nafi.
I mean, just to add to what Amos has said about rural communities, I first asked the question. I mean, the data says that 900 million Africans don't have access to clean. How do we actually provide this? How do we support them, right? It's not that cheap to have to go into solar or wind energy. These are communities that don't have any support, right? So as we are developing the plan, we need to consider the economic situation of communities and the rural woman and the ability to afford, you know, whether solar or wind energy. We need to consider all of it. We need to consider how they can support their local economies, how they can build agencies around themselves to support their development. These are all critical factors that you don't really find reflecting in government plan. And it's important that we create a platform where all of these issues can be brought to the table. What are we looking for from COP? More commitment. I agree with Amos that we want to see commitment and finances for Global South, right? We need transparency in how arrangements are made. We want that issues of Africa, right? Issues of Global South are reflected in the transactions, that if it is about gas, if it is about renewables, that we actually design the program or the support to address real needs of Africans, that whatever support goes to support the growth and development of African economy and African people. And that's what we are looking for from transparency, more money, fulfill your commitment. Very, very important.
Very important. Thank you, Nafi.
Just to add to that point, I mean, solar is now cheap. It's cheap, it's now affordable. 3, 4, 5 years ago, you know, the levelized cost for solar on average was over 10 cents per kilowatt hours. Now it's basically competing at about, you know, 6.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So it actually makes more economic sense now to actually switch to solar. And obviously, you know, down the line by the end of this decade, that cost can potentially fall below 5 cents per kilowatt hours. You know, by far our competing existing coal and gas power generating assets. So, you know, the economy should make sense now. And this is what we're trying to portray to African governments and African leaders, that right now it makes sense. So right now is the time to actually capitalize from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kofi, very much. I've literally had the 3-minute warning. So Janet, I'm going to turn to you for the final word on what you would like out of COP, and then we will round off.
Just on rural, first off, and I think this goes to, are we talking, and it was Amos's point, are we talking household or are we talking industry? And I think these are different scales. As Kofi says, the finance for you know, the small scale is pretty easy these days, and it's accessible. It's the large scale, it's also commercially viable, and I think that's really powering ahead in a lot of places. Finance is key, and I want to address the 100 billion question. As our COP presidency with COP26, we asked the question, why is finance not flowing? Because there is a lot of finance there, even if the 100 billion has not been reached. And I think we're going to pledge, I think we're going to see that the 600 billion from 2021 to 2025 is delivered by 2025, starting next year. But I think the maximum in any one year has been 83 billion. That's a lot of money, but it has not been flowing where it needs to go. And the question about that is complex structures. It is, a lot of it was headed in the direction of mitigation projects, which were loans, not grant projects, which are for more adaptation focused. And it was quite simply not going where it needed to go. African governments, in many cases, do not have a lot of headroom fiscally to be able to take on new debt for these loans, even if it's highly concessional. So I think the work that is being done through this COP and is coming out here to improve access to finance through the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and others is really, really important. We need to see the finance moving. as development partners who are making finance available, we don't want to see it sitting up there in the cloud somewhere. We want to see it on the ground working. So this is extremely important. The independent high-level expert report on climate financing, which was put out earlier this week by Vera Songway of UNECA and Lord Stern, is also really important in pointing the direction on this. So that, for me, that's what I want to see. I want to see finance coming out of this COP and moving.
Thank you, Janet, for that clarion call to get the finance flowing. So we're going to have to draw it to a close here. Thanks very much for your attention here in the room. Thank you to those of you online as well. The report came out today. It's already getting a good amount of pickup in the media, which is great. But most of all, can I ask you to put your hands together for Kofi, Nafi, Amos, and Janet. Thank you very much. All right. Just a little more people coming in there. Yeah.